Welcome to the fifth out of a six-part lecture series, An Interpretive History of Japan. Today I would like to talk about the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, which we refer to as JASA, Japan-America Security Alliance, which began in 1952 and has now continued through this year, 2012. 60 years, the longest and most successful alliance in the 4,000-year history of Asia. Unlike Europe, Asia has not had many alliances and very, very few successful alliances. In the early 20th century, Japan concluded an alliance with Great Britain called the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, 1902, lasting only until 1924. And then Japan joined the Axis Alliance in 1937, aligning with Germany and Italy against the non-Axis countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, and others, which was part of the World War II alignment. Neither of these two alliances, the Anglo-Japanese Alliance or the Axis Alliance, was enduring. And as I said before, none of them really lasted longer than 25 years. The only other alliance comparable to JASA, Japan-America Security Alliance, is CASA, the Korean-American Security Alliance, which was signed in 1953 after the Korean War and is, like JASA, still viable and effective today. There were other alliances in the post-war period, the second half of the 20th century, most notably the Sino-Soviet alliance from 1950 to 1980. But the Sino-Soviet alliance fell apart by the 1962 with the Sino-Soviet split. And indeed, even though it did not formally go out of existence until 1980, by 1969, the Soviet Union and China were engaged in skirmishes, conflicts, battles in Siberia. And so that alliance really did not last very long and is now dissipated. In contrast, JASA has lasted 60 years. This year, 2012, is the Kandeki for JASA, a remarkable achievement. During this 60-year period, JASA has survived two major transformations of the global system. It survived the Cold War. In fact, it was born during the Cold War from 1945 until 1991. And in this Cold War, of course, it faced the threat of war with the Soviet Union, war and conflict with China. But it survived this period of the Cold War and then survived the post-Cold War, the period from 1991 to the present, a period in which the Soviet Union really was broken up into Russia and other states. And the threats of the Cold War faded. And instead of nuclear war and a massive conventional war, the major threat became terrorism and terrorists, subnational threats. So it's rather amazing that JASA has endured for 60 years during a time in which the global system has undergone a dramatic transformation. The secret to JASA's longevity and its effectiveness is the multidimensionality of this alliance. Let me repeat, the multidimensionality, the fact that JASA is not just a military security treaty, it is also the framework for deep, enduring economic, political, diplomatic, cultural, social ties between the United States and Japan. And this multi-dimensional alliance has been the secret of its stability and longevity. This is not just, as I pointed out, an economic interdependence, although the economic aspects of it are critical. It is also cultural, diplomatic, political, and social. In the economic domain, U.S.-Japan trade is one of the largest in the world, and it has grown steadily since 1952. So this bilateral trade flow, imports and exports, is an extremely important element of this alliance. Included in that are technology flows, capital flows. Capital flows, hundreds of billions of dollars in the course of a day or a week across national borders. Capital flows into the Japanese stock market, or Japanese investments in the U.S. stock market, Japanese investments in manufacturing and plant facilities in the United States, creation of American jobs by Japanese investors like Toyota and Nissan and many others. So this interdependence, this economic interdependence is deep and remains enduring throughout this second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Japan is the largest allied holder of U.S. Treasuries. China holds more treasuries than Japan, but Japan holds over $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury, which supports the U.S. economy. So this is indeed a very interdependent, interlinked economic relationship. It is also individual and personal. Japanese students, tens of thousands of Japanese students over the post-war period every year came to study in high schools and colleges and graduate programs. Even today, the number is large, although not as large as in the past. There's also travel and personal experience in one another's country, business travel, tourist travel, cultural travel. 900,000 Americans last year went to Japan. 3.5 million Japanese came to the United States. So every year there is this individual, personal interaction between Japanese and Americans. And I think a minor indicator of the deep social and personal connection is the number of Japanese restaurants in the United States. 40, 50 years ago, when I was still a youngster, there were virtually no Japanese restaurants in Northern California, maybe one or two. Today there are hundreds, probably over 1,000. There are over 12,000 Japanese restaurants now in the United States, which indicates the degree to which the love of sushi and sukiyaki and teriyaki has been ingrained now in the American cuisine world. And this level of interdependence culturally is, I think, an indicator of this bigger independence economically and politically and diplomatically. There is, as a result, a very broad base of popular support for JASA and a feeling of goodwill by the American and Japanese people alike. Recent public opinion polls show that over 80% of Americans have strong feelings of goodwill towards Japan and feel that Japan is a reliable partner for the United States. Likewise, more than 80% of the Japanese people trust Americans, like Americans, and feel that they are an indispensable ally for Japan. That level of overwhelming popular support for this relationship, for this alliance, is historically unprecedented. because the United States and Japan, I don't need to remind everybody, were bitter enemies in the Pacific War and had distinctly hostile stereotypes of one another in the 1940s. And that has now completely dissipated, and we have a strong sense of affinity between the Japanese and American people. You see no better example of this affinity and sense of closeness than the American reaction to the Northern Japan disaster of March 11th, 2011, where American troops, part of the JASA alliance, immediately were mobilized to help in the relief effort and help to restore, for example, Sendai Airport. And in the outpouring of support by American people, average American citizens who donated money and volunteered in ways to help the relief effort in northern Japan. This again, I think, is a metaphor of the depth of feeling and commitment of Americans towards Japan and Japanese towards the United States. JASA is therefore not only a symbol, but a framework for the most important bilateral relationship in the post-war second half of the 20th century, and one of the most important bilateral relationships in the world. JASA is like NATO in Europe. NATO is an enduring relationship that binds together the commitments of Europe to America and America to our European allies. JASA is different than NATO in the sense that it is a cross-cultural alliance. And that makes it even all the more remarkable. Cross-cultural and multidimensional. And that is one of the key reasons for the effectiveness and longevity of JASA. Historically, the second half of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century can be described in Asia as a golden age. That is, from 1950 to the present, 2012. Asia has experienced the most prosperous, peaceful, stable, and developmental period of its 4,000-year history. This is Asia's golden age. And I don't need to remind people that in the 18th and 19th century, Asia was struggling to get rid of colonization, to get rid of poverty, to develop and become modern economies and modern nation states. And during this period, there was war, there was conflict, there was devastation, and there was relatively little economic and social progress. But the end of the Pacific War was the historical demarcation, the delineation point between past Asia and Asia, the Golden Age. Colonization ended after the Pacific War. The British, the French, the Dutch all withdrew from their colonies. Their colonies became independent. They became Indonesia, India, Vietnam. Many of these, China became independent. So Asia discovered its independence in the aftermath of the Pacific War. There were civil wars that followed. Anytime you have a revolt against colonial powers, you often have civil war. You see that in Africa today, you saw that in Latin America, you saw that in Asia. And the biggest civil wars were fought in Korea, in China, and Vietnam. These were the longest and bloodiest internal wars in Asia during this golden age of Asia. The U.S. was pulled into the civil war in Korea. It also intervened in the civil war in Vietnam. It did not intervene in China, and China resolved its own civil war in 1949 when the communists triumphed over the Kuomintang and unified that nation. America fought for years in Korea and in Vietnam and suffered extensive casualties. There were 37,000 Americans who died in the Korean conflict. In Vietnam, 58,000 died. In the U.S. Revolutionary War, which brought America its own independence in the late 18th century, Americans suffered 50,000 deaths. So Vietnam and Korea were roughly the same size of casualties as the U.S. Revolutionary War. And to give a perspective, the United States has been involved in the war in Iraq now for nearly 10 years. The casualties in Iraq, the deaths, are about 4,700 today. And that is about less than a tenth of what it was in Vietnam. So these two bloody civil wars, Vietnam and Korea, drew in the United States, and in the Korean case, helped to stabilize a divided Korea, North and South. And in the case of Vietnam, U.S. withdrew and the Communist Party took over Vietnam and stabilized that country. But my point is that in the post-Pacific War period, the wars in Asia have been relatively few in number, short in duration, compared to the long, bloody, deep wars that existed in the early half of the 20th century, namely the Pacific War. So in the golden age of Asia, which was brought into being in part by the pillar of JASA, the region enjoyed independence, sovereignty, and nation building. Asia got on the move, and China and India today, for example, are growing economically. They're becoming powerful, coming back to the top, becoming part of the elite circle of prosperous nations. All of these Asian nations are on the move. They're developing modern infrastructures, transportation, railroads, roads, airports, port facilities, mass media, telecommunications, cables, satellites, the internet. And they are developing modern modes of life: water, sewage, gas, electricity, energy, housing, mass education, and so forth, modern medicine. Most of these states are also democratizing or have become democratic. They have developed participatory and stable systems of governance. And certainly in the case of South Korea and Taiwan, you have two of the most remarkable cases of countries that were backwards economically and dominated by military government, which flourished and became stable participatory democracies and advanced highly technical economies. These two examples, I think, are dramatic illustrations of the growth that has taken place in Asia in this second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So the key to this golden age was stability, peace in this region. This was an essential environment within which individual nation states could focus on industrial development and political development. There were no wars between the United States and the Soviet Union or China, direct wars, U.S., Soviet Union. There was therefore more than a half century of peace, and in this peaceful environment, sustained by JASA and CASA and America's military preponderance in the region, Asia was able to take off on its record-setting economic growth. JASA, in this sense, made possible Asia's dynamic emergence. And JASA, in many ways, was a catalyst also for Japan's own reorientation and economic takeoff. Because in this Asia's golden age, Japan was the first Asian nation to recover from the devastation of the Pacific War, to reorient its political economy, and to launch on double-digit economic growth from roughly 1960 through the late 1980s. This JASA treaty and alliance was historically extremely significant because in the first place, it allowed America and Japan, the two bitter enemies of the Pacific War, to bury the hatchet overnight to become friends, colleagues, and later allies. So over a half-century of fighting and conflict really was eliminated by the triumph of the U.S. in the Pacific War and the conclusion of the JASA relationship. It's like France and Germany burying the hatchet in Europe. When France and Germany buried the hatchet in the post-war period, it allowed for the creation of a unified and peaceful Europe, a Europe which developed remarkably quickly. JASA also allowed the United States for the first time to deploy its forces and its military presence in Asia. And Japan was the key to America's force deployment because the Japanese archipelago sits in a critical position in the Asia region. It is at the access and exit points to the Pacific Ocean and to the Asian continent. So by deploying bases in Honshu and Okinawa, America was in a strategic position to respond to conflicts throughout the region. And so America was able to deploy its troops in Asia, and the Pacific Ocean became an American lake. America dominated the Navy and the air corridors of Asia in the second half of the 20th century in this JASA relationship. The United States has been the only country to have the capacity to massively project power, military power, to any part of Asia. No other country in the region has had that power, although China is beginning to develop it now. And through JASA, Japan was able to undergo a transformation, a metamorphosis from pre-war military state to post-war merchant state. And this transformation from military to merchant state was historically unprecedented. There is no other example in history of an economic power that has forsaken military power. The decoupling of economic power and military power is seen only in the example of Japan. And it was made possible by JASA and the security arrangement between the United States and Japan, in which Japan basically entrusted its national security to the United States and focused instead on its economic recovery and development. So this metamorphosis from military to merchant state has been a dramatic and critical aspect of Asia's golden age because the one country that had the capacity to become a threat again in Asia was Japan. But because of its alliance with the United States, Japan was an ally and a supporter of the status quo in Asia, not a challenger and a destabilizer of the status quo in Asia. And Asian nations, which had experienced Japanese occupation and war, were comforted that Japan's economic growth was disassociated from military power, and they were willing to accept Japan as a rising economic power because they were not threatened by Japan militarily or dominated by Japan politically. So this was a very big aspect of the JASA legacy. Democratization was another aspect. And by the way, because Japan became the first economy in post-war Asia to develop so quickly and to become a democracy, it started a wave of growth and development economically and politically in the region. Japan, the impact of Japan's growth and success in the post-war period affected Taiwan and South Korea, which wanted to mimic what Japan had done. It swept through Southeast Asia, and you saw remarkable growth rates in Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia. And now it's sweeping through China and India. It's kind of like an economic typhoon of growth and also a political typhoon of democratization. So this whole virtuous cycle was launched in the post-war period in Asia's golden age by Japan and JASA, this remarkable synergistic alliance. The region has seen over the past 60 years the spread of market economies, and virtually all the countries in Asia now are market economies, mixed market economies. The state plays a big role, but only North Korea and Myanmar are countries which have resisted the contagion effect of market capitalism. And they are, by the way, the two most backward economies in Asia. Even in China, you have seen the adoption of market mechanisms which have boosted China to the fastest rates of growth in human history, sustained over a 20, 30-year period of time. So this has led, this economic development has led to millions, hundreds of millions of Asians lifted out of poverty, out of sickness, hunger, poverty. And even in China alone, the number is staggering. But when you add Southeast Asia and now India, you will see that the world economy has been energized by the social and economic growth of these nations, the populous, energetic nations of Asia. So one interesting question is, would this all have happened without JASA and CASA? Would we have seen the contagious spread of market capitalism? Would we have seen the concomitant spread of democratization? We don't know. Maybe it might have been slower. Over time, it might have taken place, but the key was that there was peace, prosperity, and stability in the region, which made this remarkable golden age possible. What are the reasons for JASA's resilience? Well, in addition to its multidimensionality, it also features a preponderance of American power in the world. That is, American hegemony militarily in the world over the post-war period. And the United States, unlike Great Britain, unlike France, unlike Spain, other colonial powers, was relatively benign. That is to say, it saw its national interest as similar, congruous with the national interest of its allies, like Japan. So that unlike colonial powers which used coercion and subjugation and forced colonial nations to cooperate with them, the United States relied upon voluntary compliance and cooperation. It wanted Japan itself to desire this relationship with the United States. And if the Japanese voluntarily saw the benefits of this relationship with the United States, the U.S. felt that this would be an enduring and fruitful alliance. So that what was good for Japan was also good for the United States. A prosperous, economically dynamic Japan was seen as good for the United States. It was not that Japan was to be suppressed, as Germany was suppressed after World War I. The idea was not to punish Japan. The idea was to work with Japan, build Japan up back to a stable society and economy. And then not only would Japan, but the United States, the alliance would benefit and develop along those lines. That was the distinctiveness of America's hegemonic power exercised in Asia. Relatively benign power looking at the development of Asia, not the suppression of Asia. And so the occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952 was non-punitive. It was not designed to punish the Japanese people. It was designed to reform the structure of Japanese pre-war society and political system. And so the goal was to make Japan democratic, capitalist, and prosperous. And so the U.S. began planning for the occupation of Japan in 1942 when it was losing the Pacific War. That is, Japan had the upper hand in the Pacific War at the time when American officials began planning for Japan's surrender and the occupation of Japan. That's a remarkable sense of confidence that American officials had. And they took years to plan this occupation, to reform Japan in a way that would make it stable and prosperous and never a threat to the rest of the region. It succeeded in doing this, and it again proved that the American style of hegemony, the American style of power, was well adapted to the needs of the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century. It was, in academic terms, a variable sum benefit, not a zero-sum benefit. And it was based upon cooperation and collaboration, not upon coercion and suppression. Another reason I think that JASA has been resilient is that it has had no operational test. That is to say, it has not had to face a crisis, a war, a second attack from North Korea, for example. How would it respond to an attack by South Koreans or an attack by the Chinese on Taiwan? Those types of operational crises have not happened. The Vietnam War took place, but that was removed from Japan, and it did not involve directly a threat to Japanese national security. So JASA has not had a direct test of its operational viability. It has been adapted. The security treaty itself was revised in 1960. It was automatically extended in 1970. Elements of this arrangement, of the bilateral security arrangement, underwent change in 1975 to 1978 with the new National Defense Plan. and in 1999 with also new defense guidelines promulgated by Japan. So this treaty, which was benign and designed to lift Japan into a prosperous and stable political economy, has not faced a test, and it's been adapted. And for that reason, it has lasted for 60 years. It has helped, of course, that the region has been stable and dynamic during this period. So both at the global and regional level, as well as at the national level, JASA is an anomaly, is unusual. It is low cost, low risk, and high return. Let me repeat that. Low cost, low risk, and high return for both the United States and Japan and the region as well as the world. The main functions of JASA have been for JASA to serve as the forward edge, the shield of America in its global network of alliances. America, in addition to JASA and CASA, Korean Security Alliance, has had alliances with Australia and with New Zealand, with the Philippines, has close working ties with Singapore and now with Indonesia. And in Europe, it has NATO. It has security treaties all over the world in the Middle East. So America, of all of the global powers in history, has had the most extensive network of alliances of any hegemon in history. The Asia network of alliance has been one of the most successful, and as I pointed out, JASA has been the foundation of that alliance network. So JASA has been designed to contain communist expansion into neutral territories or new territories, and to limit the influence of communist countries, the Soviet Union and China, in the region of Asia. It helped to checkmate Soviet power in Siberia, the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and it was there as a security bastion against the development of Chinese and North Korean power. And over the decades of the post-war period, over its 60-year period, it has maintained a favorable balance of power for the United States and Japan and the Allied powers. Not a balance of power, a favorable, disproportionate imbalance of power to the advantage of the United States and Japan. JASA has also been the main vehicle for America's influence throughout the region. And because of this military preponderance of power, America has been able to exercise diplomatic power, political influence, and economic power. It has helped to set up the institutions of the economic system in Asia and around the world. You look at, for example, Asia Development Bank, you look at the World Bank, you look at GATT, you look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. These are all international organizations that are dominated by the United States and by the nations allied with the United States. And they have created an international economic system which has helped to nurture and cultivate this age of prosperity, the golden age of Asia. JASA also served to reassure countries in Asia that there was a cap on Japan's military armament because, as I pointed out before, Japan decoupled economic power from military power. So countries that had suffered attack and occupation by Japan in the Pacific War, like China, like the Philippines, like Indonesia, like Vietnam, many other countries throughout the region, they could see that thanks to JASA, Japan was not going to try to become an economic superpower. And in fact, China, for many years, even though JASA was directed at them in part, realized that because of JASA, Japan was keeping defense spending at 1% of GDP, 1% or less. Japan was still a self-defense oriented military system, and it did not develop a power projection capability, and it had no interest, no desire to become a military power in the region, an aggressive military power in the region. So that JASA, I think, has served this very important role of reassurance and stabilization in Asia, where historic rivalries are strong. Rivalries between, say, Japan and China, between China and India, very strong rivalries between Japan and Korea. These rivalries have all been cushioned by the existence of America's alliance network, especially JASA and CASA. Now, looking ahead, there are long-term trends that might erode and limit the effectiveness of JASA in the 21st century. Indeed, it might even lead to an end of JASA in this 21st century. These big structural changes include, for example, the global system moving from hegemony, that is American domination, to multipolarity, that is many different centers of power in the world. Already we see in Asia the rise of China, and China has, unlike Japan, the desire to become a hegemon in Asia, if not the world. So the rise of China is a direct challenge to JASA, even though China has not initiated wars with other countries in the region to this date. Nonetheless, the structural transformation from a unipolar, one-country dominant system to a multipolar, two or three dominant system, United States, China, down the road, India, Europe, and down the road, Brazil, perhaps. This trend in the global system means that the U.S. supremacy will gradually decline over time, although not as rapidly as many people think. Power relations are slow in developing and slow in changing for the most part. And so my sense is that the United States will remain dominant power, although challenged by China, down the road by India, Brazil, and Russia maybe making a comeback. Second structural change may be that capitalism, market capitalism, which has led to the dynamism of the region, may malfunction, may not always do well. And we've already seen in 1998 to 2000, Asian financial crisis, which rocked Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea especially. And then we saw in 2007 the global financial implosion or crisis caused by the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in the United States and the bursting of the bubble, the speculative real estate bubble in the United States. So it's likely that you will see a continuation of crises, financial crises. They are part of the capitalist system. Capitalism has not figured out yet a way to handle periodic financial bubbles and bursting of bubble recessions. We see even today the Eurozone crisis. the sovereign debt crisis, which could destabilize Europe. And because of the global interlinked nature of our economy, it will have ripple effects, very strong impact on the United States and Asia. If Europe goes through a sovereign debt crisis, American banks, Japanese banks will suffer, and you will have a serious crisis and setback to the economies of these countries. So in the economic domain, we're bound to see periodic crises occur in the world that will affect Asia. There is a massive global imbalance of trade and imbalance of capital movements. And the United States, during the 1990s and into the first decade of the 21st century, borrowed heavily from China and Japan and the Middle East to power economic growth, to consume. 71% of America's GDP was powered by consumption. And that consumption was made possible by financing from China, Japan, and the Middle East. And that kind of unbalanced capital flow system cannot long endure. It's unsustainable. And what happened was that in 2007, you had the implosion of this unbalanced financial system and a serious financial trauma, which almost led to a depression in 2008 and 2009, only because of the rapid response of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States and the central banks in Europe and elsewhere did the world escape from a deep depression. And needless to say, if these financial crises continue, the world banks, the central banks of the world, will not have the same power, the latitude, the tools to deal with the possibility of a recession as they did in 2008 and 2009. So this is a serious potential threat to the stability of JASA. Also, military technology is rapidly developing, and you're having the development and deployment of precision-guided missiles, precision-guided munition that make American bases in Japan, Okinawa, and Asia vulnerable to preemptive attack by enemies. And anti-aircraft missiles, for example, Chinese submarines have made the American umbrella, the military umbrella in Asia, much less certain. And China has gone from developing as a nation which would defend against external invasion to a military power capable of projecting its naval power and air power, missile power, throughout the region. And it could neutralize, over time, America's monopoly of power projection in Asia. The Chinese are even working on satellite systems and cyber warfare, which might cripple America's capacity to serve as a defender of allies in Asia. Chinese economic growth has been the most dynamic over the past 30 years of any country in the world. This has led quietly to huge expansion of its defense spending and its military arsenal. And China is rapidly developing a blue water capability, the capability to use submarines and aircraft carriers and air power and missile power to defend its interests and to have diplomatic influence in the region. So These structural changes mean that JASA will be facing a very different environment in the future. And it could lead to some further adaptations in JASA, problems for JASA, possibly even the termination of JASA. And in the short term, there are other problems. For example, logistical problems, problems of operational implementation. What happens if North Korea shoots, say, Nodong missiles over Japan? What happens if they shoot down and sink Japanese vessels, like they did South Korean vessels? These types of catalysts could spark a conflict which would rapidly get out of control. And so there are short-term issues as well that will have to be dealt with. So looking again at a broad historical perspective and wrapping up, concluding the significance of JASA, let me repeat again that JASA is the most remarkable, long-lasting, and most consequential alliance that the region of Asia has ever known, and one of the best that the world has known. It is remarkable in its efficacy. It has brought together two of the three economically most powerful countries in the world, the United States and Japan. Japan has been fortunate to ally with a country like the United States, reliable and basically flexible, adaptable, and interested in Japan's development. The United States has been fortunate to ally with a country like Japan, a country which is loyal and adaptable and willing to work closely with the United States. So this has been an alliance of bountiful benefits for both countries and the region. Now, the prospects for JASA are still bright over the next, say, 10 years, even though there are short-term dangers like a possible conflict with North Korea. Both countries will continue to be economically prosperous, and if Japan and the United States can both get on the track for rapid economic growth, steady, over a period of time, JASA will have even greater opportunities for stabilization in the region. So for 60 years, JASA has functioned as key to the golden age of Asia, as a catalyst for this remarkable chapter, this golden age of Asia prosperity and peace. Will it survive another 60 years? Can it survive another 60 years? That's much too far ahead to predict. A lot will happen even in the next 10 or 20 years that will make it impossible to make clear projections over the next 60 years. My own sense is that given the speed of economic, political, and military changes, it's going to be difficult to sustain JASA, at least in the same way that it has functioned in the past. But then again, in 1952, 60 years ago, who would have thought that JASA would last 60 years? Who would have predicted a Kanneki celebration in 2012? Not many. So it is entirely possible that this strong and resilient, multidimensional alliance, which has benefited not just these two great allies, but the region and the world, that this may still function as a viable framework and foundation for peace and stability in Asia. And it will extend this 40-year period of Asia's golden age in a 4,000-year historical context.